Hello and welcome to NIGP's Learning Lab. Today's session is Keep Learning and Make It Stick, hosted by Richard Pennington with very special guests Barb Johnson and Laura Shelters. Richard has over 35 years of experience in public procurement law and leadership in the U.S. Air Force and state government, 7 years of which was in private law practice. He helps in development and facilitation of NIGP's Pathways courses. He is co-author of the third edition of Legal Aspects of Public Procurement and author of Seeing Excellence, Learning from Great Procurement Teams. Richard, would you like to get us started?
I would. Thank you, Justin. You guys do great work. So welcome, everybody. I'm really happy about this today. We've got kind of a mixture of instructors in the class, and you probably don't all know this, but we do have a professional development obligation, and this was one that that NIGP offered and to make available to instructors so they could fulfill that obligation. It's a kind of a cool benny from being able to teach, and so we're very happy to have them. This is not my picture of when I was a little boy. I just happened to find this. Was that Barb, I think, asked that question. I wish I was that cute, but I wasn't. But we're going to talk about keep learning and make it stick. So you've got a couple things. One is we gave you the PDF of the book, and this is largely framed around chapter 9 of the book. And curiously, when I went into and started writing about teams, and that's been now, 10 years ago, a little bit more, I really wanted to go beyond just the team dynamics piece, although we've got a chapter 5 in there on that. I wanted to focus a little bit more on team leadership and what I call the essential disciplines. So you're lucky we're in the 9th one of these now. And we've been through project management, a little bit on measurement, analysis and decision-making, risk and change management. And it suddenly dawned on me that one of the critical issues that teams need is a little bit of idea of learning. And so that's what we're going to do today. And it ended up being the longest chapter in the book, which sort of surprised me because there was just so much. And I've got a few of the stories from the book that we're going to highlight today. So happy to have everybody. So at the end of this, this is a pretty ambitious schedule. We're not going to read the book to you, but we hope that after you sit through this and have a chance to reflect, read some of the book also in chapter 9, that you'll be able to do what I think is one of the most important things in teams, and that's conduct an after action review. So we're going to have a breakout on that. We're going to introduce you to adult learning models so that you can evaluate some of the learning dimensions of team tasks. Some of you may teach as teams. You may have to evaluate proposals that have that sort of a element to it, like train the trainer, for example. And I know I always wondered, how am I supposed to actually know what I'm looking at is going to be good? So we'll give you some resources to look at that. We're going to show you a little bit on some ways to practice, have you reflect on that and assess your team learning. Brainstorming is a big thing to do. And I think what we're going to do is if we have time this afternoon, is take a look a little bit at the virtual environment, what's happening now, maybe get some thoughts on that. I was happy to see, and you'll meet her, you already know her, but you'll meet her again, a little bit of passion on onboarding programs. I've got a story out of Cobb County School District in Georgia that introduces that. And probably we'll end up, after we share a little bit on some other creative ideas, you're going to hear Barb Johnson, who's been talking to you, give her idea of that, which I just found delightful and actually included it in the book. So I'm happy to have Barb here to reflect on that. We talked, well, that must have been 8 or 9 years ago when we sort of tackled that. And then finally, we'll try to think a little bit about how you take what you're doing in terms of team learning and then scale that out to what is known as surfing the silver tsunami. And that means capturing the knowledge, how thin it is from people like me that are old. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. So with that, it's going to be an ambitious program, but I'm going to try to make sure I'm not doing all the talking, that I'd rather you hear from a couple of the experts that I'm just so delighted to have. I call them stars because they are. One is Barb Johnson. You can see her bio here. She mentored me when I became an instructor. She's worked as a procurement officer in Ohio State, also Columbus City, and also the Airport Authority. And she was the 2014 recipient of the NIGP Distinguished Service Award. Thanks, Barb, and welcome. We're looking forward to it. And Laura Shelters, who was the architect of the Pathways program, and her team was rewarded with the Training Magazine Top 100 recognition, which if you go look at the other people that have earned that, you'll be astounded. AstraZeneca China's on it, some of the major credit card companies. We are the only procurement training organization I could find, and it's a credit to Laura in terms of what she's been able to do and bring with her higher education background. And this is just going to be terrific to tap into her experience. So welcome also, Laura. We're looking forward to seeing you come. What I'm going to try to do is get us quickly to our first breakout. And to do this, I want to talk about a story that runs through the book. It's out of Port St. Lucie, Florida. And Port St. Lucie back, it was right after the Great Recession, was having economic problems similar to what really all of us were facing. And they assembled a team and applied through the Community Services Department for a grant, a federal grant, in what was known as neighborhood stabilization. They were having a lot of vacancies in homes, foreclosures they were facing. It was really having an adverse effect on the property values, and things were just being abandoned. And what the group, which was a team led by Cheryl Shannon Barger, the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget, what they did was assemble the group in the city and had a few objectives. One was they wanted to keep the building department alive because they were suffering from revenue shortfalls and needed work. I mean, they really weren't building much because everybody was having, they were so challenged by the economic downturn. They got them together, the legal people, along with OMB and procurement, and started talking about what they could do to improve the city. And they came up with a plan that was really a hybrid procurement plan, almost using small task orders to issue against defined requirements for home renovations. And the legal department, along with the community services and the building department, went out, identified suitable property, and they purchased it. And the idea was to renovate it and then sell it, and hopefully get some people that would take care of the property after it was fixed up a little bit and start getting people into the homes again. Well, it was a $13 million project. They didn't have a lot of time. They did some innovative things. They first of all waived a lot of the publication periods for sealed bidding because they needed to go fast. Cheryl, the one thing I thought, and it's talked about in the book, was she actually used credit cards to advance money for suppliers or vendors that were going to go in and do renovation. Raised some eyebrows for a while, but she was able to convince leadership that, it was necessary to make this happen. Well, they went out through phase one of the project first and started identifying the homes, pre-qualifying trades, getting them to come in, issuing some fairly broad-based, ambiguous specifications to get the work done on the homes, and had a fair amount of success. And then they went into a phase two after they did the initial pilot. And what they learned was that what they had really thought was going to happen didn't happen. It didn't take off the way that they thought in terms of the interest. And what the question then became is, what why is what is happening? And what was happening was there were suppliers that had participated in phase one that didn't want to do it anymore. And they couldn't understand exactly why. And they tried to figure out what was the reason between what they had expected in terms of this interest by the local trades to renovate these homes and what was actually happening, which was people were starting to bail out of the program. And they talked with them. And what they learned that they were able to incorporate was many of them had gone through the work of the pre-qualification, but they weren't getting any work. And part of it was the specifications were so kind of vague, and people were bidding on it like they thought they would do in terms of trying to live in it themselves if they were in these homes, these distressed homes. And of course, what that was doing was sort of warping the price competition, and some people that thought they had a good chance to actually get some work just weren't getting it. And what Cheryl and the group that pulled this after action review together learned was that they had the wrong people probably doing the initial inspections, and they started using building inspectors that were a little more familiar with what inside the home probably needed to be done, and revise the specifications to start getting a better and a more clear picture of what they were trying to do to make these homes livable. A couple of things they learned. One was it's okay to talk to suppliers. You know, we have an issue with that, I think, often we're afraid to talk with industry. And what they learned was, you know, this is really okay to talk with the suppliers. And that was probably one of the keys. The other thing they started doing was actually having a bidders conference, a pre-bid conference on each of these homes. Even though this was done quickly, they did walkthroughs so people would see a great amount of success in phase two with the involvement of the local industry, getting some of these homes renovated, and they got the money spent. And because, as any of you know that have used federal money, there's a time limit on it, and they did this quickly. Did they succeed on everything? No, there was some property that they couldn't get, they bought and really couldn't make their money back on, but that was a risk that they decided collectively to take as an organization. But overall, it was a great success. What we learned from this is it's called an after action review. And what you do is you ask, what did we think was going to happen, and what actually happened, and what are the reasons for the difference? And I don't think we probably do this enough. And what I'd like to do now is to let you go into breakout now and talk among yourselves about three questions. And this is going to be our first activity. It's after action reviews. And there I've got the summary of the questions. And what we'll do is break you up into these groups. And there's not numbers involved here, so you're going to have to remember which you are. But the group one is going to talk about, what's an example of a project review on a team you've served on, and what did you learn? And did you make any adjustments going forward? And of course, the second thing is, what's an example of a team activity where you might have benefited from one and it wasn't done? I'd like to know that. And third, how can that approach be used to scale out to, as you start losing people to separation and maybe retirements, the silver tsunami, maybe get group three to just talk a little bit about that. So don't make the instructors do all the work. If you got instructors in your room, we've got people here that aren't instructors, and this is your chance to practice. So it's like everybody's back. What's an example of a project review on a team you served on? What did you learn? Did you make any adjustments going forward? Who was going to summarize that? Did they enlist you, Victor? Did they enlist you?
Yeah, because I was the one that was taking notes, so it always falls on the person taking notes, which means if we go to the same group, someone else is taking notes next time. What we took away was we none of us had really examples of a formal process. It's more of on the fly, dealing with situations as they come up, and that they're more of learning opportunities than mistakes, because if you make a correction as it happens, we're talking about a ship, you can get back on course, but if you wait till the end to notice you're 3 degrees off and 300 miles away, it's harder to make that change. But Veronica talked about with a scenario with COVID in their school districts, where previously they would share school supplies. That wasn't going to be possible because of COVID and the fact that everyone's no longer together. But they were able to pull up the data on usage, and Central was able to make individual kits. The lesson learned from this was teachers really didn't get a chance to participate in creating those kits and would have, hands-on, feet on the ground type data to share. Now they're being pulled into it. So moving forward, the teachers will be consulted when creating these kits.
Nice summary. Team 2, what's an example of a team activity where you might have benefited from a action, after action review, meaning you probably didn't, so you didn't
We
have
have
one.
2 reporters. The first one is Mr. Ed Paber.
Hey, Ed.
Thank you, Barb. Richard, I just mostly told him about we get around and do that process after every construction job, after every construction project. You have a closeout list of what went wrong, what went right, and you get there with the project manager and you go through that, and that really helps out with the construction project. So as you move on, there's other things too. When you're trying to implement, as Barb has taught me over the years, to implement a strategic procurement plan, you got to get together with your people sometime and talk about short-term goals and long-term goals and time frames.
Great.
So
Great.
And Christine had some great additions also.
Well,
Hi, Chris.
not only on large project-based efforts such as, implementing technology is a classic example where if we go back and see what we could have done better, and usually all of that is captured and, fed back to the implementation teams, perhaps the, overseers of the project, in that to help this be more successful, not only going forward, but if a similar technology project is, undertaken. But then also if there's challenges in the form of formal protest and appeals, I've seen that very successfully used, where we go back with our procurement team and the program team, particularly if there's been material challenges brought up through the protest and appeal process, and either their challenging process or requirements, and just taking a look back at that to try and avoid that in the future.
Great. Thanks, Chris. Great insight. And team 3. So the book has got some other things on the silver tsunami issue and a little of that, but I did want you to reflect on this learning activity in terms of teams, what you learned from that in terms of capturing knowledge of retiring or separating employees. Who wants to be the spokesperson?
Richard, that would be me.
Okay.
All right. So we have several ideas that came out from the group. The first one is documenting what went wrong during the process, but also, documenting the history behind it. Why is something being done that way? From all areas, not just procurement, but from other areas that are involved. The second big point was getting enough perspectives of what went wrong, not just from the the head honchos and such, but as I always love to say, but the worker bees who are doing the work that might have some other insights about what went wrong. And it's always good to get everyone on the same sheet of music, to make sure everybody's doing things the same way, because as I mentioned, when you change organizations, they might do things differently than what you did before. Well, that can happen even within our own teams and our own organization. So, learning how other people do things might actually help us find ways to put these things in place. And the last point, which I thought was great, was having everyone take a portion of your policies, procedures, whatever you're doing, and teach a piece of it back to your organization, whether they're the lovely silver tsunamiers or our up and coming millennials, having them teach, because not only do they learn the processes or learn what could go wrong through the teaching of it, but then other ideas come to people during that process that can be brought back to make changes to your policies, procedures, or how you do things.
And I love that last idea. We had people leaving when I was a director. And I failed in one aspect. We said, well, we need you to write down everything that you do, and that was a way to fail in terms of people just aren't motivated. But if you can get them to team teach a little bit, even if you're doing the heavy lifting on the on the PowerPoint development, a lot of that, just to get them up so you can get to what we call the tacit knowledge, the stuff that people just don't know. Sometimes I've heard and seen written, the know who is half the thing. And a lot of the more seasoned employees, they know kind of who the good stakeholders are and who you need to have. So great insight, everybody. The reason I do this is and this is on committees too. We don't often, or probably enough, spend the time just circling back to kind of figure out what we learned at key milestones, maybe, or even at the end, and factoring that in. So nice job, everybody. What we're going to do now is go to the out of the after action review and go into the part that's making it stick. And this is into some adult learning theory. The instructors on here are going to recognize this because we all kind of learned it, but it's important for teams too. And I hope you'll take away from this the importance of having some feel for what these principles are when you're ever designing training, when you're going to forum and trying to figure out what you want to go and see. It's a personal sort of an approach that you'll use also. So we're going to talk about a little bit on stickiness and what these things mean. One of the approaches is to look back yourself on a time when you learned something new and retained it and actually used it, and then find out what was the one thing that was most important to you. When we instructors learn much of this out of books, for example, and I saw one that was later called Facilitation Basics, which I thought was particularly good. And one of the things we learned was that there were some steps or key things that teams need and individuals need in order to learn, like readiness and active involvement, which is the how of learning, and sensory learning, mixing up what we call blended learning, and accommodating the individual differences. When somebody stands up in front of a room in the days when we did face-to-face and we're trying to mix up and blend the approaches, a mixture of like case studies that you read and moving in a room and the rest of that, you're trying to mix up and have the sensory learning and use a variety of things. Accommodating individual differences in terms of what they do know already, which is part of it, and building on the experience of people in the room, not just the instructor in the front, and then finally practice, and then getting feedback in terms of the assessment. Those are the essential elements of what we call adult learning. Readiness is probably one of the most important. When you go to forum, ask yourself this: why do you need to learn this topic when you're trying to select? And then the other part of it is, what do you know about it already? That's a place to hang on some of the concepts that you're going to hear when you go to forum. And as a team and you're developing training, try to get that integrated into what your planning is, so that you kind of work on blended approaches and trying to reach the audience and the people in terms of what they need to know. The how part is probably what we focus on the most, and how we choose the different methods. And a team would do this too. If you're doing any kind of onboarding program for new employees, what are the methods that you're going to use in order to try to get the learning stuck? I first saw Barb Johnson's Purchasing Gone Wild presentation. I think it's been 8 or 9 years ago when I saw her do this at the Virginia Procurement Forum. And I was just intrigued by it. So intrigued that I interviewed Barb, put her in the book. And that's been
Thank you.
a long time ago, right? Yeah.
Right.
So a long time ago. And it was, she called it Purchasing Gone Wild. And I've got a couple slides that aren't in the handouts that I gave you, the 3-slide per page, just to give you a sense for this, that captures some really key elements of it. One is, the tales of failure and redemption. Another word is resilience, and it runs through that story, to be honest with you, is a method of learning. And it's a different approach to learning that Barb would use. I particularly like the part of the story about when they were implementing their e-procurement system. And of course, they were the central office. And one of the things they did is they had 2 tags. And the one I know for sure, which was ask me again. They would wear a badge so that people didn't feel afraid to admit that they may not get it. And it was ask me again. What was the other one, Barb? I forgot.
The other one was refuse to be a victim.
Yeah, refuse to be a victim. That's the failure part. And so I just thought I think she had about 14 to 17 slides in here. I picked a couple, but why are there failure stories, and why do we share those stories, and why does it help build resilience? So Barb, I told you I'd ask you that question, and that is, what was it about? I mean, what caused you to start that? I'm just curious.
Well, initially, it was actually a blip on a Harvard Business Review article that talked about how we don't sit around the fire and tell stories and learn from each other's failures. And I really started thinking about it a lot because, in part, with this, hate to use the word automation, that's so futuristic for the 50s. But anyway, when we were going to go through this, I thought, you know what, we have got to talk about this, because when you're implementing especially an ERP system, or really any project, you're going to have some crazy things happen. And one of the things we did also was we put a jigsaw puzzle in the break room, so people would end up telling each other stories while they're putting this together. Oh my gosh, what a great team building technique. But anyway, the failure stories and the stories I've heard over the years as a result of this presentation have in great ways stuck with me.
Yeah.
So that was the genesis.
So you made it stick. I mean, that's the simple question I think we always ask when we're in teams and we're trying to figure out ways to impart knowledge and help create knowledge, is how do you make it stick? That's one of the issues with teaching, is that everybody's charged up for the 3 days they're in a class, and then you wonder how much of that actually is going to last, at all. So, thanks for being a mentor, Barb. I mean, that's terrific.
You say that, but I learned more from you.
Oh yeah.
Thank you.
We all know what explicit knowledge is. We all have that written down. We get that. And I think the hard part when you're trying to build expertise is figuring out how to develop that tacit knowledge that people have. That's what makes them experts. There's been studies that show that between just the lecture, sitting in and listening to a sage from the stage, which is usually about a 5% retention capability on that. As you start to build in some of the other ways to engage knowledge, like reading goes up a little bit, auto-visual both, which is kind of what we're doing now, starts to get it a little bit higher. When you just demonstrate something and show them, goes up a little even more. But when you get to the other things that we're hopefully doing here a little bit, getting you used to, like discussing, maybe even practicing, and I'll show you that here in a little bit, and especially teaching. I found that once I started talking about this stuff and writing about it, it stuck. My guess is many of you kind of find the same thing, and it's a nice little visual to explain sort of why how these things are different and why we engage them different. So we've got 3 things here. Explicit knowledge. That's the stuff that's written down. Procedural and declarative knowledge, where you can actually give people steps on stuff. And then the tacit knowledge is the big part, the hard part when you're losing employees. And who do they know, and who are the stakeholders, and what are we call it heuristics. What are the little rules of thumb they use? I mean, to get through the day, and how do you find that? So the procedural knowledge is in the manuals, and it's in the practice that we actually use all the time. Like, you receive the proposals and you instruct the evaluation panel and you evaluate the proposals. But how you do an evaluation, and whether you use a numeric versus a sit-down consensus, there's a lot of knowledge in there that you're not going to find written anywhere until you try to do this and fail a couple times at it. And that is the hard thing, I think, for instructors to impart and for teams to be able to help, and for procurement professionals to teach teams to do, and to mine, to mine that knowledge out of there. And that's when you're trying to hit the tacit knowledge. I was in a DU when I first started thinking about knowledge models a little bit. I learned a little bit of this in the instructor course, but there are several ways that people are better at learning. I tend to be a reader, and that's kind of a cognitive. Some people just can't stand to do Zoom. They want to be in a room with people. That's kind of a social learning sort of model. People are better at that. I'm a mental model person too. When I see something, I want to figure out, how does that fit into change management theory? And even this morning we were talking about resilience on our radio general manager and our program director, who are both here, Barb Johnson and Victor. And we were talking about a little bit about resilience, and there's models to that too. And some people see stuff that way. Other people don't see it that way. Then there's behavioral. I mean, when my wife was learning ukulele, and I hear all the time, and she's learning by repeating it. So some people do that very well. And I'd say we have some little bit of behavioral sort of stuff in terms of what we can learn, probably even in how we do spreadsheets, and some of that we do over and over again. Inquiry is problem solving, is a way of learning, and experiential. When you go to a debriefing, or you practice a debriefing and a mock debriefing before you go to the debriefing, you're experiencing questions and how everything's changing. That's a different model of learning. Now, do you just go and do the one you like? Are you just going to go to forum and say, well, I want to sage from the stage, I'm just better at that? It's better for you, and it's really better for everybody to try to engage this in a series of different ways. And that's the way instructors in many respects do this, because you never know who's in the room, who's got the, which type. So you try to build in various of these, like breakout rooms, so people can talk, a little bit of social reading, and then a little bit of the sage from the stage, like I'm doing now, like way too much of. So, but what you try to reach is the ability to mix up and the experiences, and use various sorts of things. And teams are going to do this too. If you're building programs, if you're evaluating proposals, you're trying to see if people are using variety. Is it just seeing and doing? Are they just sitting on a stage, or are they just giving you stuff to read? I mean, is that your onboarding process? You just give people a manual and say, it's all here? I bet a lot of us have been there. Teaching and writing and telling, I've mentioned that already. Role playing and simulations. I hope we are. Are we getting together now and planning for the next pandemic in terms of tabletop exercises, and what's going to happen if we have to do this again, and mobilize people? Case studies. I've seen Barb do that. We did that at Forum with coming up with some cases, and have people experience what it's like to testify, and see what it's like in a room to see that. But what are you trying to get? Active engagement. And with that, an opportunity to reflect. And the reflection piece, I think, is something we often don't think about. That's what we just did on the after action review. We thought about that experience, and that's what Port St. Lucie did, and it reflected on what they learned, and then what they could do going forward on that. So there's Laura. Welcome back, Laura. She just didn't want to dive into this before now. So let me just tell you a story. This one isn't in the book. This was, I think in 17 is when I wrote this story for government procurement. I was searching to find examples of mentoring, because that was the word even back then it was being used. And I happened to be looking at the National Procurement Institute. They have the AEP, the Achievement and Excellence in Procurement Award. And the nice thing about that was, if you remember, you could go on and see some representative responses for that award. And I looked in the continuous improvement and kind of the learning section, and saw the word mentoring in the Cobb County School District. And I called Barbara Bates, and Barbara Bates at the time was the assistant director, and to her credit, within the last month has been elevated to the director position. I touched base with her a couple of weeks ago, just to make sure I wasn't going to lie about things that they were doing, and they're still doing this. But what they had, and Barbara explained to me kind of how they did the mentoring and the onboarding for that group. And they, when somebody came in, they did the traditional things. I mean, they showed them the website, gave them the manuals, the things to read. But then they filled out a spreadsheet. They put the topical things in that people needed to know in the school district, and this applied to experienced people. The woman who I was at the heart of this when I had called her, they were in the middle of an onboarding, had about, I think, over 10 years of experience in procurement, but not in the school district. So what they did was they built the spreadsheet and included not just the topical items that were in the book, but also a trainer's name, and they put, and they were targeted. Some people are stronger at certain things, and they would put the people's names in the office, and then they would have a completion date and there was an expectation that you would sit down and you would actually talk with the person over the period. What they also did is they invited review of more senior procurement professionals' work. So the new employee came in, she was given a book, she has a name, and then when people would put together bids, they'd give it to her and say, what do you think? What do you see here? I mean, in some ways, it's something we call generative learning, because she hasn't learned it all yet, but now she's starting to think about how to review work and make comments, and then that's going to promote a dialogue. They found opportunities for building guided experience, like going to pre-bid meetings, something that people may not have done before. And if they go, you learn a whole lot more than reading the manual that says we encourage the use of pre-bid meetings so people understand the context of the project, because you start understanding how you actually are going to operate in that environment and start anticipating the kinds of questions. You found not only did they learn that you could find these opportunities to practice that way and to get experience, but what she also told me was there was patience. And I think that they expected the onboarding process to work through the dialogue with each of the people in the office was going to take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. It was going to be something that was built. Of course, they would set priorities for the things quickly, and then they would identify the things that she needed to do right away and then kind of build on that. And then they would have little mini trainings that were they asked her to provide, so that if they sent her to a course, like an NIGP course, she'd come back and they'd do a little mini training and a staff meeting, 10 or 15 minutes just to hit the high points. Why? Because when you talk about it and you teach it, I think it sticks. So that's blended learning and mentoring in Cobb County. Laura, I think you did hear that. I was surprised at how passionate you were about the whole onboarding thing until we started preparing for this. And so, in a few short minutes, we kind of touched a fair amount on adult learning theory. Can you share your story? You had one about onboarding, your personal story about onboarding.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Again, apologize everybody for my quick departure, but I'm back. Living in a construction zone has its downfalls sometimes. I actually started before working for an IGP. I worked for a series of government contractors. So that was probably my first touch with procurement, right? But that's not public procurement. I can tell you they definitely don't follow the rules like you guys do. Part of my job with the government contractors was training and development, helping with not only contracts, but then our own internal employees. And one of the things that I am, like you said, passionate about is onboarding. And some of the in the handout that Richard shared with you all, some of the stats that I pulled to share with you guys really show the critical importance of onboarding. As many of you know, and this is a phrase that we use in my industry all the time, it is way more expensive to have to hire or fire and rehire, right? So a lot of people just think, oh, I'll get rid of the problem, or I don't want to have to train the behavior. I don't want to train them up. I'm just going to find somebody new. That is the worst mindset you can have and will never work well in an organization. And the thing is that your other employees start to realize that that's how you view them. But One of the things that I was really exciting for me to take on was an onboarding project or creating a whole new onboarding plan for an organization. And through the research, what we realized was you cannot design a one-size-fits-all onboarding experience. You need to make sure that it's tailored either to the position, to the task that that person is going to be working on, or even onboarding to the culture of the group or the team, whatever that looks like. And so what's helpful is when you really start looking at workforce development and even, trying to identify what are the workforce needs to train and get somebody onboarded, it's really great to be able to build kind of a plan where you take somebody through their first 30, 60, 90 days, and they're able to follow a checklist and really be able, see things that they're checking off and knowing that they're, reaching the end of this onboarding experience. You should definitely pair them with a senior mentor or a senior, colleague that allows them to have somebody access to, answer questions. And so all of that work, and it is a lot of work. I mean, you don't want to dismiss the fact that there's a lot of effort put into this, and it takes a long time sometimes to implement and get everybody really on board with embracing that type of onboarding program. We would have the VPs from all of our departments come in and present to new hires to make sure that they understood kind of what everybody does from cradle to grave. So really, again, just a very robust program. And all of that being said, why do we do that? Ultimately, it's because 90% of employees say that onboarding is how they determine if they're going to stay with an organization long term. If they don't have that good experience right off the break, they're going to leave. Now, the scary part of this, and this is where we can all try to make things better, especially in our industry, is only 12% of employees out of, I forget the number of organizations, I can share this stat with you too, from a Gallup poll, only 12% of employees felt that their organization onboarded effectively. Wow. That's scary. I mean, honestly, that's a lot of money that organizations are wasting, because even if you're building an onboarding program that's not effective, you're still spending money and resources and time putting that in place. So it is very important to make sure that that is like your first touch, right? With an employee, with a volunteer, with whoever. Make sure they know you care and you're putting that time and attention to them, and that you're accessible. But that's that, Richard. I just wanted to kind of share that that program that I built for the organization before I left. In the 2 years that we rolled out that onboarding program, we had a 94% employee retention rate. So the proof really is in the pudding. When you start to see the data coming from that, the more you invest in your employees, the better they will work for you. I promise you that. So,
and and it was funny when you and Barb and I were speaking, I remember you saying that you went in and were onboarded once and you kind of felt lost. I mean, you had a personal experience of that too, didn't you?
Yeah, so I was hired at a hospital system to do instructional design and training. They did not have the infrastructure. I got there, I had no guidance, no direction. I'd be told to go to IT to help with technology so I could do my job that I was hired for. And IT kind of scratched their head and said, well, we don't have that ready. We're not here to support you. Needless to say, I was only with that organization 5 months. So it is an exact reflection of kind of, in my opinion, as an employee, that experience needs to be good so that I feel confident that I've made the right choice and that this is a place that I want to grow with and that I can call, my home. And ultimately that all drives to the culture of an organization of people feeling like they're family, and having that open, transparent communication. It's just a trickle down effect. So. Wow.
Yeah. Great story. Barb, one of the themes we're building here is the difficulty of, some say you transfer knowledge. I believe you don't really ever transfer knowledge. You help people create knowledge. But one of the hard things is tacit knowledge. You had a great story about a ride along, and tell us about the ride along and how that kind of fit into this whole thing. Curious.
Well, excuse me. So the ride along is very much like Christy had indicated, that I always invited newbies or folks who I didn't think ever had an experience, even if it wasn't their commodity area, to different meetings. And people would complain about having to be in all these meetings. So sometimes we would talk afterwards and I would say, do you have any questions? Particularly, I think this is really important at pre-bids or anytime you're doing a specification meeting or something. So I call it riding along. I mean, it's low pressure. How many times have you said, you know, if I was a fly in the wall in that conversation, I'd have picked up a lot. So that's what I used. And I did finally have to like totally explain to people ahead of time. I know so-and-so, you know, wasn't necessarily, that wasn't their job, but it could be.
Conversations that you have in those environments, I think that really do well. You know, Laura, we've been talking about teams, and some people are wondering, well, wait a minute now, I'm not going to develop a onboarding program for my organization, although I think you'll probably be involved in it, many of you. But how does this affect outside of this, like volunteer work on committees or chapters? Does this have relevance, that whole onboarding sort of knowledge creation thing?
Absolutely. So I think the key thing to remember is no matter how you're engaging in a team, whether it's volunteer, or whether, you know, it's paid opportunity because it's your job and that's what you're paid to do. There are dynamics to communication and how people interact and personality types. All of that kind of feeds to how you're going to get somebody to engage with you and, you know, participate and collaborate in a team. And speaking specifically to NIGP's efforts a couple years ago, and I think Richard and maybe a couple others on the phone were involved in this. We actually developed, you know, training for our volunteers that are working with NIGP because it is very important for them to feel a sense of community. They need to understand the expectations for their role. You know, what is it that they are expected to do? How often should they engage? We actually put position descriptions together for all of our volunteer engagements. Whether it's volunteer or not, it is a job. You know, we're asking them to produce and to collaborate and talk. So again, just being very transparent with expectations. And then the training component of that is really just going into a little bit of adult learning theory here, if you don't mind. The key thing to remember about adults, and especially if you're trying to figure out how they learn or what makes them tick, adults, they are under the need to know. So if you look at children in the classroom, or if you're teaching kids, they're just soaking in and learning because they're being told to, right? A teacher is telling them this is what we're doing today, and they just are kind of robotic in that sense. But adult learners need to know why they are being taught, because they already know that learning is a part of life, right? It's part of a new job. It's a part of new software, anything like that. So you need to be sure to capture, you know, why are you engaging me in training? Why is this going to be beneficial? Or what may the consequences be if I don't engage in this onboarding? Or, you know, what would happen in a volunteer team is, you know, there'd be breakdown of communication potentially, and that doesn't allow that team to be effective. Another thing that is important to keep in mind from an adult learning theory perspective is the whole concept of readiness to learn. So for an adult learner to be motivated, the timing has to be right. It really needs to be moment of time applicable. You know, when you're in elementary school, you're told eventually this learning, you know, this math you're being taught will be useful for you in the future. Although I can tell you, I don't know, I would probably argue with my math teachers about that now, but it is, you know, it is just important to remember that volunteer teams sometimes are only going to be effective in a very specific timing throughout a year or throughout a program, whatever that looks like. Then the kind of two other things here. The one thing that I think a lot of people don't really remember when they're planning an engagement with a volunteer team or even with an internal team, adults are bringing a wealth of diverse knowledge and experiences to any learning event. And that's important because adults want to be acknowledged as an important resource in the adult learning environment. So Richard, this goes to your point, which you were talking about a few minutes ago, those communications, when people are talking and when they're active participants in a discussion, you know, that's when they become, a resource as a part of this learning experience. And that's when you're going to really see people open up and start to share and not feel like, oh man, I'm forced to be here type of attitude. And then the last thing that I would mention from an adult learning perspective is that adults really do need to be able to make decisions and be in control of their learning. So what's great about this, again, when you're setting up a volunteer team, you give them that position description, you set the expectations out ahead of time, and then you let them opt into that. So yes, I'm totally on board with this. I'm excited. I want to do this. And then, they're able to kind of feel like they're in control of that experience. So those are the kind of 4 things that I would say, really, those are adult learning principles that absolutely apply to teams, whether you're volunteer based or otherwise.
Yeah, tell us how you really feel. Yeah, okay. So, hey, it looks to me like you got your hands up, Barb, although it's going to toss you a question anyway, and that was, one thing I've admired about you is the way that you stay engaged with NIGP, and I know I've seen your bios on chapter involvement and stuff. How did your experience with NIGP and chapters actually inform your approach to teams? I'm just curious.
Well, first of all, I'm a people person. I am. And part of the reason to stay involved, or a great many reasons to stay involved with NIGP, but one of them is being able to collaborate with amazing people. And in that collaboration, if you're going to, if you're truly going to benefit, there has to be a balance between what you're injecting in the conversation and what you're hearing. And so some of that team management, well, as instructors, is asking questions versus being, as Laura might put, the sage on the stage. And my issue specifically, I've been with NIGP, doing something with NIGP since 1984, started when I was 12, but I had 4 years of active work under my belt. And I had some pretty dysfunctional people in the organization. And so immediately, I'm trying to figure out how to really make us more effective. And it worked. And in some cases it was minimizing certain people's involvement and determining what they were really good at and letting them fill with that role. You're managing, it's not just that you're doing more work than anyone else. Do you ever do that? You get promoted and you think what you're supposed to do is more work than anyone else? No. You also have to step back and look at the whole picture. Is that what you were looking for, Richard?
Yeah, and I'm going to give you a cross-examination question now.
Do it.
Isn't it true you said you learned more from the experience of the NIGP and chapters than you ever learned at the agencies about teaming?
Absolutely, because the majority of people at NIGP were well adjusted. A lot of the people, not that everybody doesn't have, some sort of agenda, but because you're collaborating with such incredible professionals who have a wealth of experience, for me, it's pure joy.
Laura, do you want anything to add to Barb's comments? Just curious. But you get it all.
I think she covered it all, but I want to emphasize the kind of the theme of just, communicating and talking and, finding out what it is that makes people tick. And I do think as you see a new generation of workforce and volunteers come up, that's something that actually you have to train people to do. The younger, generation isn't as comfortable with their voice and isn't as comfortable with sharing. So that can be a challenge for us as we move forward.
Barb, earlier in the Learning Lab series, we kind of talked about the life cycle of teams, and deforming, storming, norming, performing, and those things. And adult learning principles kind of emphasize the importance of readiness. And I'm just kind of curious how those two ideas work together to you. The idea of the team life cycle and the whole idea of readiness and learning.
They're inseparable. They're absolutely inseparable. They're more inseparable now than they've ever been because I shouldn't say nobody. Most people do not do their jobs in a vacuum. If you can't get along with people, if you can't work with them, if you can't learn from them, your job is majorly interdependent with someone else's, including your private life. There was one person in my neighborhood who knew how to crack the before and after school program enrollment. And honest to God, if I had not talked to that woman, I could not have worked as well because I had no idea we were in a new neighborhood, new school system. How the heck do I get before and after school care for my son? Now, yeah, I might have found something else, but if you're willing to be interdependent and work in teams, life just hands itself to you.
Yeah.
I'm not kidding.
We had talked, I showed a slide on readiness before, and Laura kind of validated that too in terms of readiness and adult learning. And I think teams, in many respects, as you're starting to work with teams, especially when you're leading teams, the readiness part is a part of the whole forming storming thing. It's getting people comfortable with one another and getting ready and the rest of that. I'm going to move to the end of this, and to me, assessment of learning has always been a hard thing. I teach the legal aspects class, and we give the exam, and that book goes on the shelf, never to be seen again, and you never know what sticks. How do you know things are sticking, Laura? I mean, in a team environment, where's the assessment piece to all of this? And I know this is probably an issue you deal with in Pathways all the time too. Just curious.
Yes, absolutely. So I think the biggest thing is having just a continual feedback, model when it comes to communication. The other thing that I tend to do is, when setting off or kicking off a team project, we follow very light project management here. So we're not PMP by any means, but we do find it's very valuable for us to have that structure to help us, create intention in our meetings and, make sure that everybody's heard, giving everybody a space, on the agenda. But as far as assessment, I think there's a couple things, again, setting the stage with ground rules and kind of what the expectations are. But also I think kind of having values for teams, right? So these are our values. We're going to be respectful. We're going to, really embrace the team spirit and, defining what those are. And it can be 3 to 5, not a huge list. But then, one, that allows you to hold people accountable. So if you're in a meeting and things get a little bit tense, something that, we're doing internally with my staff too is, hey, you actually are not really embracing the respect value right now, Richard. I think I just want to, tell you that I think we can get to this end result in another way. But that takes a lot of time to get to a place where people are comfortable to speak like that. So again, it's developing the values, putting in that groundwork to just say, hey, we don't have an issue here. We just want to make our team stronger. We want to make sure that we are effectively working and moving forward and communicating in the right way. So setting the stage with some values and just being able to hold each other accountable, it goes a really, really long way. The other thing that I like to always plug in from that adult learning side of things is Kirkpatrick's assessment model. So I can send out some details around that. But there's 4 levels of measuring assessment with learners when you're looking at that. And a lot of it really looks at behavior change, as you get higher up on these levels. And when you're working in teams, it's important, again, to just have 360 feedback or do reviews with teammates to say, hey, how do you think your teammate is working on the team, or even you as the leader? How am I supporting the team? What could I do better? And I think that that's the critical component, is just one, having that open, safe space for people to be able to share feedback. And that really does trickle down from the top, right? The leader has to really live and breathe that so that this team feels safe. And then, you know, the other thing I'd like to share, and I can send it over to you, Richard, after, volunteers, you can still assess the learning, right? And I think part of that is creating assessment forms. Like, we have assessment forms that are very simple that we use for all of our committees, where the chair and the staff liaison sit down in 15 minutes, kind of run through and say, you know, does this person, do they respect and work well with others? Are they completing assignments with quality work? And so again, just being able to hold people accountable, because at the end of the day, accountability really is hand in hand with assessments, right? Like, assessing people is just holding them accountable for their work and for what their deliverables are.
Yeah, and, you know, and when we were speaking about this, there's a phrase that Barb had used that is stuck in my mind: friendly but firm. And I wrote that one down. I mean, if I put this in perspective, we do try to encourage people to fail. Some people are better in a team environment than others. We like to have challengers sometimes to watch our training, but there's ways to do that and ways to not. So there's a role for leaders, right, Barb? Friendly but firm. What did you mean by that? Just curious.
What I meant was, certainly you want to maintain, above all, the relationship. Don't lose the relationship. But you have a duty. You have a responsibility to coach someone or make some tough decision. In many ways, it's very helpful to demonstrate those attributes so that other people can adopt them. I don't want to fall on my face. I want people to tell me in a nice way, firmly, how to move ahead.
Yeah, cool.
I was just chiming on to what both Laura and Barb said. It seems to me that a lot of times hearing what you both said totally soaks in, but sometimes I just don't feel brave enough to follow your advice, right? So I think that's kind of a key thing that I've learned in my life, is sometimes you just have to be brave in asking for feedback, like doing a 360. Someone's got to be willing to go out and ask for that feedback from all the different directions. And even harder is if you decide to hold somebody accountable, like you were talking about. Well, a lot of people aren't up to the task of saying, hey, I need to hold you accountable right now, because that exposes you, right? So you have to kind of come up with that bravery and then do it the way that Barb was talking about, where you do it in a friendly way. You don't want to have it backfire and lose the relationship, but yet sometimes you have to confront people. I have this little reputation in my agency for being somebody who's, you know, I keep like what I think of my motivation is real strong integrity. And sometimes that lets me speak up to the people who have more power than me. And I still have to tell them, you know, hey, this isn't working, or this is something I want you to consider, or whatever it is. And that's where the learning happens. Because otherwise, if you're afraid to talk to somebody, they're never going to learn. You're never going to learn. There you go.
And you know, that's a great observation, John. And part of that is, it depends on kind of where you are in the team framework. I mean, there are some people that you have the ability to keep team members on a set of norms, and you practice trying to identify the ways that you agreed to operate. And then if somebody is not operating the way you agreed, that's a conversation. You've also talked, though, about scaling leadership up to the conversations that you sometimes have to have with people that report to you. And so there's a range in there. And I'm with you on that. That was the part I never liked about managing, was having to have those conversations, because I always kind of felt like, why are people wasting my time? I mean, personally, and that was difficult for me, but great observation. So we touched on this, the assessment of learning, and the thing I liked about with the Cobb County story was, in a team environment, a small group environment, by involving peers in the training and even helping design it, you start to have those conversations to be able to assess where people are. It's conversations. I mean, just having the conversations. Same thing in I think what we're doing in volunteer work is having the conversations that that help you figure out if people kind of are getting it. I've got a story in there about the Colorado kind of a peer assistance program that we used to have those discussions with other colleagues and the rest of that. You might take a look at that. But what we were trying to do was use the peers' experience and expertise to just train, but also assess whether people were getting things. And so the other thing people want to know often is how they're going to know where they can learn more. And I mean, that's something that, you know I always want to know. I'll go and watch a PowerPoint presentation, but I come away kind of going, okay, now where do I know more about it? And the way I handled it in the book was with fairly good footnoting and some resources, but where do you learn more? And I enjoyed and saw an example of this in Sound Transit. And I've got a story about Sound Transit, not exactly this one, but they had the online activity task checklist breakdowns. And online, when you clicked on certain things with links, they would actually send you to the source documents that they were talking about in checklist form. I thought that was terrific. And then we've got lots of stuff now. I mean, I used to be, you had to go to librarian to figure out where to find anything. That's not the problem now. Now the problem is curating what we have and trying to find out if what you're looking at is actually useful. But the publications libraries, communities of practice, I mean, we've got a lot of excellent resources now to answer the question, where can about the topic, I think. And then I spend a bulk of chapter 9 talking about creative ways to share kind of knowledge, expertise, and experience. The learning theory on this is a great book if you're into this stuff. Came out of, I think it was St. Louis University, a couple of professors, but that really explained to me in a team environment, if you're developing training, if you're doing onboarding, the importance of things like spacing out the practice, generation, which means having them attack a problem before they may know all the answers to it, just to start energizing their brains and get them to start the critical thinking. Elaboration is the teaching piece. If you can get them to talk about it and write about it, that reinforces it. And interleaving, I used to worry about having little building blocks that always went progressive. And now I realize that, you know what, going backwards periodically, energizing the parts of the brain to take a topic and then stop it for just a moment, maybe peek back at something that was related, apparently, the science says, is kind of helping us learn. And then ask, when can you practice? So I've got a few things up here we'll populate with in terms of when can you practice. Go teach somebody else, go have that conversation. Ask them to co-present. Used to do that in a law firm. And because I learned as much from them, as they did for me. Record yourself. The folks that are on the Nigp radio, go, you don't have to listen to yourself as many times maybe as I do, but go ahead and listen to yourself. You'll if you're into presentations, that really helps you. Informally job shadow. Ask somebody if you can go with them to a meeting like Barb. Can I ride along with you to the meeting? Barb, tabletop simulations. These are some ideas on what to do. I'm a big person on mock debriefings and negotiation plan. Get somebody to test you with hard questions so you can figure out how to adapt what you've got to. That's how you practice. We don't get to be like baseball players and have thousands of reps. We've got to find other kind of creative ways to do that. So. This is my model that's in the book, and I touched most of these already. It's one that I finally came up with. When I try to go through this checklist. When I go to forum, when I go to anywhere, why learn this? I mean that's ultimately the question. What needs to be learned, and how should the topic be engaged? Am I going to go to somebody and just watch? If I go to something and see that they're doing tabletop discussions, where they're going to allow us to frame a little bit the discussion, now I'm intrigued because I get a little social part of this and And it really helps me figure out how to get to reflection and even to apply. And then I do ask who can help assess. I'll go up afterwards and ask somebody on a presentation, okay, who would you tell me to go talk to if in another 4 months I want to try this and I just really want to test it. I think the mentoring program is great for this. You can find people that have experience with this and touch base with them. You know, and then where am I going to learn more? I'm a reader. I'm trying to find more about it. And then how do I practice that? I think the NIGP and the chapter volunteer capabilities have great practice opportunities for all of us personally. So kind of use it. So before we do the last breakout, I think we have time for this. And this is where I think I'll bet this is Christy Varda's setup. I'm embarrassed by what mine looks like. This is so orderly, so I just had to show this. But what about the virtual environment? How, in terms of just learning opportunities, how are you all looking at that? I'm just curious.
So we will return, right? We are planning to return to the classroom. However, we'll never get rid of virtual. I think we saw tremendous success. NIGP has been in the virtual space well before, COVID. So it was nice because we had that foundation. But just some quick things that maybe people, that aren't as involved in instructing or with our chapters, our chapters that have historically struggled to schedule classes with us, to get, even 5 people to sign up for an in-person class, are getting 30, 40 registrants for their virtual courses because they're opening up beyond their border, right? They're able to look beyond their state and their region and kind of open it up. What that does is not only revenue generation for our chapters, which is always a fantastic thing to be able to support them. However, when you broaden your reach and you bring those very diverse perspectives and the different personalities and, the way that you do things in procurement in California is very different than the way that you do things in procurement in New York. And so from my point of view, who I am very biased because I'm a huge believer in virtual learning, it can richen the experience because you're able to bring in these additional voices. You're able to tap into folks that are from different, time zones, different countries. We building pathways last year, we had a gentleman, a member of ours that was working with content development from Guam, 12 hours difference from us, dialing in and being a part of that team and jazzed to do it. So I think that, what you're going to see is we're going to start being a little bit more innovative with our offerings around technology, so we were an early adapter to virtual conferencing. We're looking at new platforms to richen that experience for our attendees. To really deepen the connections, because as we've talked about today, that's really what this is all about. And as long as we can continue to provide an opportunity to deepen those connections virtually, it won't go away, but it won't replace face-to-face, right? There's always the beauty of being able to hug when we can do that again and reach out and just touch somebody and, just say, hey, it's good to feed off of that energy. But I could say, I don't want to put anybody on the spot. And Joy, I hate that you just turned off your camera. Joy is 100% remote instructor for us. And I would say, I would hope, but Joy, I'd love to hear your perspective on just what that is for, do you still feel connected to the teams that you work with and the students?
Good question. Joy?
Unmute.
I thought I did. It gets better over time. Let me move my microphone down so you can hear me here. It gets better over time. At first, it's very weird because you feel like you're talking to this vacuum. But I think since we have really, truly changed the model over the years since I started teaching online, that where we've actively worked to get participation by doing breakout rooms. I focus primarily on doing review courses for certification. And so with those courses, it's very hard to work in activities where you get involvement from your students. But we have managed now with the NIGP CPP review to do that. Now, I can't imagine, hopefully when you guys are doing the rewrite of the CPPB and O courses that perhaps there's opportunity for that, because that's the biggest complaint I hear from students is that, you know, they don't have a chance to discuss because we're trying to cram too much information into 8 weeks. And so that's the challenge there. But yeah, I still love it. I don't want to do anything else. It's convenient as an instructor. I mean, I liked the travel. Now I'm not physically able to do it, but I enjoyed the travel, and I certainly enjoy being in a face-to-face environment. But for the climate that we live in these days, to have the opportunity where people can budget training a lot easier by having virtual options, and they don't have to pay for hotel rooms and meals and those kind of things, makes a world of difference for a lot of departments, especially when I was at City of Savannah. We were constantly cutting budget. And so the first thing that would get cut would be training dollars, because we had very little else except for personnel costs. So, you know, being able to have that available is, I think, very important in this day and age.
You know, the question I would ask you and Laura and everybody really is, when you look at the adult learning model, and let's put aside availability a little bit, and let's put aside cost, those are important. But if you're just looking at the ability for people to learn and knowing why you're trying to learn, what you know already, how you want to engage, how you're going to assess, where you can learn more, what is there anything about the virtual that we're a little thin on that? I mean, the example would be when we used to walk around in the classroom, we always heard that having the blood run actually helps learning. I mean, you may think it's silly to go to different parts of the room, but actually moving helps the learning process. Now, we try to do that. I didn't let you do it here because we were, you know, but do we lose there? Where does the virtual suffer? Or social learning. Some people need the ability to be in a room that way. Does this solve that problem? I'm just curious. Anybody? I only got a couple of minutes. Anybody, or put it on chat. And what are we missing?
Dee Dee is raising her hand. I'd love to hear.
Go ahead. Dee Dee, go ahead.
Personal opinion, virtual is nice, but I prefer in person. It is far too easy for people to get distracted. They get interrupted. They'll take a phone call. They'll do this. They'll do that. And I mean, I like virtual, but I prefer face-to-face and meeting new people, because there's always the oh, well, let's go to lunch, or let's go to breakfast, or something like that. And it's virtual is very sterile and impersonal.
Yeah. Okay.
This might
that's
be
a good lead in, you know, and that's a good lead into our breakout now, because you all are going to be on leading evaluation teams that have suppliers that come in, and you often are going to ask them to give us their train the trainer approach. And so what we've given you here is at least a pretty good scale or a landscape of the adult learning principles that Laura's talked about. And when you get these proposals in, what are you going to ask them? And how are you going to assess what they're telling you? I mean, are they going to open that book that I showed you and just give you some pages out of that? Or are they going to do it in the context of what you're doing? So what I'm going to do now, we're going to end with a couple slides after this, but I would like you to get together. And I have been informed that everybody's pretty good at this and that nobody's shy. So we're just going to do a random recreate now into 3 rooms activity on learning and procurement planning. So you're a member of a team, and you're planning for acquisition of an online evaluation tool. Bonfire is one, for example. So you're getting stuff in on bids and proposals. You're publishing, but what you want is the way to do distributed evaluation committee meetings and scoring. And you don't have that right now. So you're asking them to come in and propose that. And here's what the work group's going to look at is a train the trainer requirement in there. And when you look at the top, you'll see group 1 using the adult learning that is in there that I've just showed you. And it's a simple one, but which of the questions do you think they'd be in the best position to address? You're not going to have all the answers. They obviously are training. Which ones you think that they would be pretty good at addressing on a proposal? And there it is. You know, is it readiness? Should you be asking them? They're the ones that know how best to get this stuff across, you know, and how to, you know, where to look for additional. I mean, are those the things you're going to ask them? Pick a couple that you think are most important. It's group 2 and group 3. These are going to be a chance to do interleaving. So we're going to test your ability to write assessment statements about, for an excellent approach to this, here's what we would look at. Just write a sentence, and you can do this in probably less than 25 words. And I break this down into 2 categories. When I've done assessment things before the decision model and RFPs, usually the way you write it on the technical approach is different than past experience and demonstrated capability. It's just a different sort of thing. So how would you write that? An assessment standard you would give to a committee saying, this would be excellent. Normally you're going to phase these from excellent down to like you didn't respond at all. I'd prefer you didn't respond at all, because that's too easy to write. The better one is, how do you write an excellent response on this? So what I'm going to do, and this may fail, this is a part of Barb's thing. We may fail at this, but give it a go about what you're going to tackle. So the first one again is going to be, which of the questions you think the proposer has the expertise or should to address? So you might ask questions. 2, write an evaluation standard you're going to give to the committee on the technical aspects of the training with these kinds of issues involved. And 3, what about how do you assess their past experience on this? What would you kind of want to know to get an excellent proposal? So yeah, everybody, if you're back, what we're going to do is put it on a whiteboard. And I've got room 3 at the bottom. They've got a question. We're going to talk about standards a little bit. Room 2, I heard you talking about a standard for excellence on the approach. And then room 1, which of between readiness, the how, the assessment, the where do I learn more, how do I practice, what is the supplier probably in the best position to do? So to do this, you'll click on the view at the top. Could be on an iPad, a little pencil. Once you click on that, there'll be an annotate selection. When you hit annotate, you'll get a little menu. And the menu will start with, there'll be a text over to the left. When you hit the text button, it allows you to place your cursor and start typing on the whiteboard. So go ahead and do that. The question of how, I think that's a good one. I think they're the ones that are going to be able to, even on a train the trainer, to guide experience, promote the reflection, to know best how to get us learning about their system. I think that's probably the one I would pick too. Let me, I've got room 2 was the technical. And this is an example of a standard, the way they're often written. They propose a superior approach that exceeds requirements in tangible ways and demonstrates in-depth comprehension of the entity's requirements. And that's a good generic one. Notice it doesn't specifically be training, because that standard would be used for other things like the system's capability, how they're going to do the implementation, other things. But that's an example of a standard. And then what you would do is look at that and then talk as a team about the superior approach in an adult learning situation. What is that? Well, they've addressed how very well. That would be an example of how that would be applied by evaluation committee. And then 3, they've asked the question as if you might ask in a proposal. If you flip that to a standard, it might read something like, the supplier's experience demonstrates their ability to learn over time and come up or adapt to have superior approaches. And you're focusing really on the experience. And then you would talk as a committee about, let's talk about the training. Why do we think that's true? Because they've done this a lot. I mean, that would be an example. So nice work. That is a little bit about adult learning, and gives you some idea of how you can integrate that into that knowledge base, which you're doing with proposals. This class was about leadership, And we've got 2 stars in the profession, really, and many others here on this call. I want to thank both Barb and Laura about this. We're going to have a final lab that's not going to be a lab. It's going to be a webinar that's free in May, on May 19th. We'll talk a little bit more about lead laterally, choose to help, but you've seen it demonstrated here in many ways. I heard some of you talking about purpose. I bolded the one about questions because often this is what you focus on when you're trying to get other people to reflect, is the use of questions. But we've also built in a little bit of structure and adult learning theory. Step into the side of other team members. I've heard that a little bit about getting them to engage, asking what they think on things, and then committing your time. This takes time. I mean, as the instructors know on this class, we're not getting rich doing teaching, and it's important to do that. So with that, every day is a school day. Come see us at the webinar on May 17th, and we'll be showcasing all the people that have contributed, the stars in the profession, and talk about lateral leadership. And I enjoyed it, everybody. So thank you very much.